Today we're coming in live from the office of one of the most well-known psychologists on cognitive development, Jean Piaget. Thank you for having us today.
No, thank you, Sarah Ann Bellum, for coming to hear and learn about cognitive development.
So you have some interesting thoughts on the cognitive process. Can you describe that?
Sure. I believe that there are 4 stages in the development process: sensory motor, pre-operational, concrete operational, and formal operational stages.
Tell me more about the first stage, sensory motor.
So from when the child is born until it is 2 years old, they just gather information using their senses. They start to touch and see things and understand the world from what their senses tell them. They begin to have goals and understand object permanence.
What is object permanence?
Object permanence is when children start to understand that things still exist after they leave the room. Think about how a small baby cries and cries when their mother leaves its sight. The baby doesn't understand that the mother still exists within the context of the world without her being right beside them. Whereas when the child is older, the child understands, my mom still exists while I'm at school.
Ah, excellent. I always laugh when my dogs think I'm pouring food onto the ground when I'm actually pouring it into the bowl.
Yes, that can be funny, but what's really happening is that they don't have a schema or the representations that help people organize knowledge. While children in this stage do not have what more developed children have, they do have basic understandings of when I cry, I get food, I get changed, or attention.
I do that when my husband won't get me food. So what is the next stage after that?
The next stage is pre-operational, and it ranges from 2 to 7 years old, but I believe that there are 2 sub-stages within this.
Like preschool and elementary school?
Well, it is similar to those age groups. The first is the symbolic function substage, which focuses on kids from ages 2 to 4. They spend most of their time thinking about me, me, me. They have a strong understanding of egocentrism, but have problems understanding what might be going on with other people or different perspectives.
So is this when my kids were younger? One would build the castle and the other one would tear it down because they just felt like it.
Well, of course. They had no regard to how the other one felt.
So what does the next substage deal with?
It's called the intuitive thought substage. Children from ages 4 to 7, what you call the elementary school age. They are dealing with primitive reasoning, focusing on only one aspect of the situation, centration, and have a lack of conservation.
So can you go into centration and what lack of conservation is?
Of course. Centration is when a child focused in on only one aspect of the situation.
This is like when one of my kids at this age was upset that our ice cream didn't fill the entire bowl, but then was happy that the bowl was smaller and she had the exact same amount of ice cream because it looked bigger.
Exactly. In order to go into lack of conservation, we have to first discuss conservation. This means that even though something looks different, it still has the same amount of mass. As an individual who has been through the stages, you know when I pour 12 ounces into a big 42-ounce cup, it still has 12 ounces in it. But when I pour that 12 ounces into a 16-ounce cup, you understand that it's still 12 ounces even though it looks like it's more because of the container it's filling. So children between 4 to 7 will not understand this fully or at all.
All right, I get that. So you mentioned schema during the stage of sensory motor. How does that apply in pre-operational?
Well, as the child gets older, they have to create more and more understandings of the world. So they create schemes for both procedural and factual knowledge.
Would procedural knowledge be how they know how to get ready in the morning for school or how they raise a hand to be called on in class?
Exactly.
And factual knowledge is knowing what a bus is or what a school is?
Yep. And from then they know how to integrate new information into an existing schema or assimilation and even adapt their schema or create new ones to fit new information, i.e. accommodations. When I come stateside and I want to drive, I have to refit my information for how to drive in Europe to how to drive in America.
So that would be an accommodation? I thought accommodations were just a hotel I stayed in last night.
I mean, it was, but it's also how your brain creates new schemas or adapts old ones to fit new information. As a child grows, they assimilate, grow, accommodate, and change how they think completely, which is why a 2-year-old thinks differently than a 12-year-old, and a 12-year-old thinks differently from a 22-year-old.
So this all sounds great, but let's get back to understanding conservation. When my kids were 7, they were still having trouble with understanding a short fat cup can hold the same amount of water as a tall skinny cup. When did they begin to understand that?
During the concrete operational stage, which is typically children from 7 to 11 years, they will have a pretty fixed understanding of conservation. So they should begin to understand that concept by now. Along with conservation, they will also have an understanding of classification.
What do you mean by classification? Does that just mean that they will know that a tomato is a fruit but doesn't belong in a fruit salad?
Not exactly, but it is good that they know that. Classification is the understanding that the people in their lives can have more than one purpose. For example, they would understand that you, as their father, can also be someone else's brother.
So if they were to classify and sort out things based on their length, weight, and volume, that's also classification?
No, that actually goes into a characteristic of the concrete operational stage called seriation, meaning the child is able to organize items based on their quantitative dimensions. This also touches on the final part of the stage, which is transitivity.
Oh, I know about that. I remember learning in algebra. That's like when 9 is bigger than 8 and 8 is bigger than 7. Then through transitivity, I know that 9 is bigger than 7.
Exactly, this stage has a lot of forms of thinking that are a little more complicated than the previous stages. But back to your kids that you mentioned, how old are they?
My kids are 12 and 15. Which stage would this constitute? They are better about solving their own problems and can talk through particular issues that they're having. They're also great about testing new limits and proving the validity of information. However, it isn't all sunshine and daisies in the Bellum household. Both kids seem so full of themselves and they only think about what they want and need.
Yes, the formal operational stage is the final stage in my model. This typically encompasses ages 11 to 15, which would definitely explain your children's attitudes. In this stage, thinking is more abstract and at a higher emphasis is placed on logic and reasoning rather than blanket emotion. Problems are solved on a more individual basis and verbal problem-solving skills are established. The testing of hypotheses is covered under something called hypothetical deductive reasoning, where systematic approaches to fulfilling a scientific method are more apparent and conclusions are reached without unnecessary assistance or affirmation.
Then what about the greater sense of personal needs?
That would be the adolescent egocentrism in action. There is a sense of individualism and heightened self-consciousness in this age group. In a perfect world where the model is followed exactly, children would leave this stage by the time late adolescence rolls around.
Well, that's all we have time for today. Thank you for coming in and clarifying your stance on development and the stage model. Are there any other words of wisdom you'd like to impart before you depart?
Of course, when it comes down to the brass tacks of the theory and how to implement it in, say, a modern classroom, the solution is quite simple. Take each of the 4 stages and draw out a chart where each would lie in the life of a child. Then take the specific needs and developments I've discussed in the stages and place it systematically in the graph. Cater your teaching method and techniques to the age group you are teaching. For instance, let's take the age group 11-15. This covers most high school students. If you were teaching in a high school, you would follow the formal operational guidelines from the chart. A couple examples would include allowing the students to discover conclusions and information for themselves and encouraging an open and creative atmosphere. Beyond this, just try to empathize with your kids and give them the best education experience possible.